Welcome to the second in our series of the Podcast Catalyst panel discussions. The Podcast Catalyst is all about showcasing Africa's podcast creators and connecting them with their new favorites, be it tools, techniques, or shows. My name is Sean, and with International Podcast Day later this month, I wanted to look at the rise of podcasting across Africa, but specifically South Africa. So in this episode of the Podcast Catalyst panel discussions, such a long name, you can expect to learn more about the industry, how far it has come, where it started, where we're going, with what I like to refer to as two podcasting powerhouse guests, Rutendo Nyamuda, Tinswe Media and the Podcast Sessions, and Gavin Kennedy from Solid Gold Podcasts. I'm stoked to have you both here. Welcome to the panel discussion.
Hey, thanks, Sean. Stoked is a good word.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Sean.
To prevent this from becoming a monologue, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves. Otherwise, we don't want to hog the microphone at all. Rutendo, won't you please give me a little bit of a synopsis in a nutshell? I know we could talk a lot, and you've done so much. So without to take anything away from what you've achieved, where did you start? How did things get going?
Thanks so much, Sean. Great to be on the show. So as mentioned, I'm Rutendo Nyamuda. I have been in the media industry in itself for the last 10 years. My background is actually in journalism. So I started off writing for the likes of Forbes Africa, CNBC Africa, worked in TV and production. I've done PR, I've done corporate PR, you name it. And then, in 2017, I had this idea of, oh my goodness, I'm having so many incredible conversations with friends. Why aren't we recording this? And so launched my first podcast, which was called In My 20s, which was just conversations about people in their 20s, about life, love, careers, resigning from your job, traveling, you name it. And so that was my initial launch. And then the bug just caught. And, you start to think to yourself, what else is possible? What else can I do? And then, the pandemic hit. And, where a lot of people maybe thought to pull back, I was kind of like, let's ramp up. Now is the time to create. Then in the midst of the pandemic, launched a mother tongue poetry podcast called Inside Once Out. Had a number of clients or people who came in for consultation and were asking questions. And then I had the epiphany of, I don't have all the knowledge. I'm still fairly new. I'm always learning. So I'm still, grassroots, very green to podcasting. And so then launched the podcast sessions, which was supposed to just be a podcast. But that also just took its turn because I was like, my background is in publishing. Why don't we launch, a newsletter, not a newsletter, a lead magnet, which was super simple and now became the Podcast Sessions magazine. And we have the news website. So it's just been building all along. Also important to note that I do have a full-time 9 to 5. So this is in between everything else that's happening. But, if it's exciting enough and you're passionate about things, you'll always find time. So that's me in a nutshell.
Beautiful. And we could expand and talk deeper into so many of the things that you've mentioned there. And I look forward to being able to do that over the next 30 minutes or so. Gavin, I would say I'm the greenest in this group. I haven't been doing this for nearly as long as either of you. But simply by way of the gray on your chin, I'm going to say you've been doing this for a little bit longer than both of us combined.
Lovely. Thank you. I've been doing radio and television and post-production and live outside broadcasting and editing and facilities since the early 90s. Been there, done that in so many different things. Depending on your age, if you think back to things like Body Beat, we used to help produce that and record that. And we did election coverage and we did Mike and the Mechanics concerts for SABC. We did so many things over the last 30 years. But in the early 90s, we started a radio station called Solid Gold. And that was in the time when broadcasting was first deregulating and they were starting to issue licenses. We were young and stupid and we weren't strategic at all and didn't get one of the first licenses. So we pivoted into in-store broadcasting and we started one of the first in-store radio stations in the world with Stuart Kennycore using satellite to deliver. And we did that for many, many years. I sold out of that business in 2008. It's still going strong with a whole bunch of corporate clients. Lovely business called Air Media. But I took a break and did other things. But what happened, 7, 8 years ago, maybe a little bit longer now, one day while driving after dropping my kids at school, I just noticed myself not listening to the radio in the car anymore. I just was suddenly aware that I hadn't listened to a radio station for some time and was connecting to my phone and listening to podcasts. And it was like this real aha moment. Hang on, am I the only one or the other people doing this? And I would ask, I started doing some research on it and asked people about podcasts, and I just got this blank stare. What's a podcast? And I just knew then. This is what 25 years of being in media has got me ready for, is making podcasts. This is just
Amazing.
right up our alley. We've got everything for this. It's nascent. It's exciting. This is the future. So I, took a break from my sabbatical and got back into audio post-production and editing and stuff, but focused only on podcasts. Built 2 studios, added another one, and we've just been doubling down. We're now up to 11 studios.
Wow.
Along the way, we've added audiobooks as well. And the funny thing is, for 7 or 8 years, we've been saying it's still early. And even today, it's still early. And you'll unpack that as we go forward. Now you'll see it's still early in this space, despite us feeling like, oh my gosh, this is such an exciting thing.
Yeah, I was saying just this weekend to friends, I'd feel like for South Africa, maybe I'm feeling it for South Africa specifically because this is where I'm based and there's the conversations I'm having. But there's this massive wave of podcasting and it's been building for such a long time. And I feel like I've just hopped onto the crest of that. I feel like I'm riding on the surfboard of everybody else that's been building this massive momentum towards the coastline. So over the next 30 minutes or so, I do want to cover a lot of things and we'll see where this conversation goes, including that South Africa has been producing podcasts for a long time. My 16-year radio career has taught me a lot about what I know and what I put into practice. My first solo produced project for on-demand listening was called Unstoppable, and that was also only released during the 2020 pandemic. So 2023, I've made this sort of my full-time thing, and I'm investigating all the different facets, and it feels like it's coming at me so quickly. But Gavin, then as the podcaster on this call that has the longest track record, how would you say the industry has changed over the years? I don't know if you want to go 10 years back, but even 5 years compared to today. How are things looking? And what are we looking at 5 years from now? And Rutendo, I'll come to you in a second as well for the similar thing.
5 years ago, there weren't a lot of people making podcasts. We've got some OGs in the space. We've got some people who've been making podcasts for 10 years in South Africa. But those were less. I'm going to go sideways here. The word podcast is quite loaded. We use the word podcast as if we all think it means the same thing. But podcast has become code for independent production. That's mostly what people mean when they say podcast. That's why there's so much confusion about whether there's a video or there isn't, if it's done at home, all that. We really just mean, I made this. So 5-10 years ago, there were a lot of people doing that, but they weren't so much the hobbyist as sound professionals who had a side hustle, who were doing something at home. And I think we get some insight into the early days of podcasting if you look at what they were called before the name podcasting came along, and that was audio blogs.
Yeah.
So if you look at what does that say? Well, the blog space had got so big and people were looking for innovation in that, and they started adding audio. That's 20 years ago now. What's happened is one of the things that happens to everything that starts growing is that it becomes commercialized. You look at Facebook, it was all cool until the advertisers arrive, and TikTok is all cool until the sponsors arrive. So podcasting is going through that currently, the arrival of the monetization and the ad agencies and the programmatization. But that's only one of the layers in it. As to what it's going to look like in 5 years, ubiquitous. Anybody who's saying, I'm not really a podcast person, I don't really listen, 5 years from now, they're going to be listening to on-demand audio. Whether you call it a podcast or not, they're going to be listening to it far more. And there's a possibility that the word podcast may fall out of favor and disappear in place of go to my website and listen to my biography. Or you might give it a new name, but in essence, this pre-produced, on-demand, anytime, anywhere audio is not going anywhere.
Yeah, yeah, and we're already seeing that. Haven't we? They're recently releasing stats from the States talking about how on-demand or online listening has now reached that same level as terrestrial listening, or as it was live listening, right?
Yep.
Rutendo, you mentioned you started your first podcast just prior to lockdown, which wasn't even 5 years ago. Were you listening to podcasts prior to making your own?
Yeah, it's actually very interesting. I mean, for me, even, how Gavin mentioned, these audio blogs in a sense is like, because of my journalism days, we used to record a lot of our conversations on dictaphones, and then you
Right.
play them back to write your stories. And I think, I think one day when I was packing up things, I found one of my interviews and I was like, oh my goodness, this has so much color that the readers will never see, right? So you
Mm,
have those kind of little bits and these little moments. And then we fast forward to 2017, and a lot of the podcast or audio content I was listening to were a lot of sermons. You're listening to a sermon while you're cleaning the house and you're listening to things in the background. And then it progressed to a number of international podcasts, because you're just like, this is such a relaxing way to understand and absorb content. But I do believe that even, 2017, when I started, there was this like fear. I had no audio experience.
mm,
I had no understanding of, what mic to buy. And I even remember buying my microphone. It probably sat in the corner for a good week. And I was like, oh my goodness, okay, now I have to just record something. And, that's how you think of it. And I think that's how a number of people are getting into podcasts. Yes, with a lot of knowledge. And that's really different. I mean, you're thinking about a space 5 years ago where if you weren't someone who was tech savvy or came from radio or had a backing, there was this thing of like, I have a podcast, but you had to be someone, in the media space, so to say. And
mm.
nowadays we're just seeing everyone, anyone, like a blog, like, people always say like, oh, there are too many podcasts in this niche. And I say, just look at the beauty YouTube influencers, and you'll know that there are millions and millions of them. And I feel that is the same space that podcasting is in. There are never too many, and you will find your niche, and people are jumping on that. So it
Mm.
has been an interesting change. I think it's also interesting how people are almost making it more of themselves. We're seeing more personalities shine. It's yes, you have the commercialization aspect of it, but there is something about I want you to connect with me. And that's the way social media in itself, and this is a social platform, is moving as well.
Yeah. On that note, then, Rutendo, would you say there was a podcasting and then podcasting 2.0? There seems to be this revival into the second sphere of podcasting. And Gavin, maybe you can speak to this as well, where it's not so much us telling people things, it's us trying to connect and really offer value, as opposed to just spewing information. Really connect, really build communities, really have a sense of who that person is behind the microphone. I get the impression that previously, or way back when, I say way back when, 20 years isn't all that long for an industry to be running. But there's been a shift in the way the content is being created and how it's being consumed.
Certainly. I would definitely say right now it is a find your tribe kind of a thing. I like to see and listen to podcasts as if they're a friend of mine. Yes, there is a
Mm,
part of me that listens to podcasts because because I'm in the industry and more on the businessy side of the industry and the research side, and I'm really interested in a number of things. But the podcasts I listen to and consume, it's like a friend. You keep coming back to the
mm.
conversation. If it's a health and wellness podcast, maybe there's an area. I mean, I love listening to like psychology podcasts, and
Yeah.
even as a single person, I listen to a lot of those couple podcasts. I love those therapy podcasts because I feel like I'm gaining something from it. So
Yeah.
I come
For
back, and
free. Yeah.
they feel free. That becomes my therapy. Or a business podcast, instead of like going onto a news platform, I get insights and the tidbits from these conversations. But you also get, which to a certain extent, I feel like with the news media, sometimes we don't actually always, we need to like balance opinions more. And I feel like podcasters have opinions, and they
Mm,
have very strong opinions about certain things. It's not always about being objective. It's, this is what's happened in my life. This is my perspective on whatever it is, tech, health, finances, business, which I feel is something that people are yearning for. People are yearning for a connection. And that's why you can never have enough podcasts because we're so many different personalities with so many different perspectives, with so many different backgrounds and experiences that will shape the conversations that we will have.
Mm, mm. Gavin, the things we've seen the Northern Hemisphere, shall we say, do, the guys in the US, the UK, I suppose Southern Hemisphere as well. We look at Australia, those predominantly English-speaking nations that have been doing this for a long time, that have taken their journalism skills and taken it into really good storytelling as far as podcasts are concerned. Are we learning fast enough from them to be able to produce as good content? And my answer is yes, but I'm interested to hear what you've taken from those that have been doing it for a long time and extrapolated into the clients that you work with on a day-to-day basis.
The skills and the creativity and all that stuff, there's no shortages of skill sets by any measure. The fundamental challenge we're facing right now is people don't know why they're making podcasts. And if you don't know why you're making a podcast, you're just going to drift around aimlessly for a while. So let me give you a scenario. Let's say you said, hey, Gavin, I'm thinking of going for a walk every morning. Can you give me some advice? I go, okay, cool. Why are you going for a walk, Sean? Well, I want to get some exercise. Okay, if you want to go for exercise, I recommend walking 5 kilometers, and you should time yourself, and you should go faster every day, and you should get your heart rate up to X, and you should increase the distance every week or month. If you said, oh, I just want to clear my head and go for a stroll in the morning, then I'd say, well, then you should walk a different route every day, stay away from traffic. So the thing you do completely follows the why. Now, podcasts look a lot like radio, because most of the skill setters initially come from radio. And that's not foreign. Any new technology comes along and encompasses or evolves from the previous one, and initially it looks like that. So 120 years ago, all cars looked like horse-drawn carriages without the horse.
Sure.
Well, because that's what they were. It was the easiest thing to convert into a car. But at some point, you stop converting carriages into cars and you make cars. But we still have horses. And we still have horse-drawn carriages. Not as many, but they still exist. It doesn't completely kill it. So podcasts are not here to kill radio. There's going to be a space for radio. I think it's going to be more parochial. It's going to be more local, less streaming, different conversation. But initially it looks like that, and that's where the skill set were. So the people making podcasts were the people who knew how to edit, the people who knew how to write stories. But that's no longer the case. But back to the going for a walk story. I think if somebody says they want to make a podcast, just work, follow me on the logic here. You might be making a podcast just as a hobby. Cool, I want to make a podcast for fun. 6 months from now, I'm going to ask you, are you having fun? Yes, carry on. That's the only metric of success that matters if that was your purpose. I'm having fun. If you say, I want to have fun and meet interesting people, cool. 6 months from now, are you having fun and are you meeting people? Yes, continue. You might be saying, I want to increase my public speaking skills. So 6 months, same question. Are you having fun? You're meeting people, increasing your skills. If you are, continue. If it's not that thing you're doing, then you're making a podcast for a business. And then your most important question is, am I making this podcast to sell an audience or to sell to an audience?
Good
and
point.
Those are fundamentally different, and you're going to make two different podcasts depending on them. Now, the challenge you asked, the state of the nation here, the challenge we're having is most people go into the second one of those, but making a podcast that sounds like the first one, and it can't work. So the first one is a pure ad play. I'm building an audience. It's a CPM play. I need 5,000 listeners every week. When I drop an episode, so I can charge 500 Rand per 1,000 and earn a living. That's a podcast strategy. That's a media play. The other one, when you're selling to your audience, is I've got a tribe. I've got my people. They follow me. I'm trying to build authority and trust and thought leadership in that space. But it's still not a hobbyist podcast. It might sound like a hobbyist podcast, but it's not. The metrics of success are: did more people trust me? Did more people sign up for my newsletter? Did more people become customers? So that, for me, is we clear up which of those three kinds of podcast you're making. Then all those skills exist, and you can put them to good use to make that podcast.
Yeah. And listening to you speak about that, I mean, I already know from a talk I did yesterday, people are like, how do we get more people to listen to podcasts? Why don't they consume the content that's there? There is a fair amount of education that then still needs to happen as to, I listen to a podcast for the first time, but it's not the content that I like. And all of a sudden I don't like podcasts. But in actual fact, if we can find the content that is going to resonate with you, you're going to open up an entire world that you aren't aware of. Do you find that as well then, that there's a disconnect with, you've already said earlier that podcasting is this catch-all phrase.
Yeah, matric English is a lot like that. Here, read these 3 books. I don't like them. I don't like reading. No, wait. Find some other books. Listen to the books. That thing where you say people coming to you and saying, how do I grow my audience? That only matters if you are making a podcast where you're trying to build an audience and sell them to the advertiser. In that instance, the audience is not your customer. The audience, your audience is the product you're trying to aggregate. 5,000 of them, 10,000 of them, AB income, live in this area. You're trying to build a demographic with predictable numbers that you can go to an ad agency or an advertiser and say, every Tuesday, 9 o'clock, I drop an advert, 5,000 people, a podcast, 5,000 people doesn't give me some money. Yeah. Numbers only matter for that podcast. If it's a hobbyist, what matters is what percentage of crocheting circle people in South Africa are listening to your podcast. There are 500 people who crochet, 20 of them listen to my podcast. That's a meaningful percentage of that audience. And if it's a business podcast, you don't need lots of people listening to your podcast. You need the right people who are in your sales funnel listen to the podcast to move them through it. So the only of the 3 where the number is the metric you should be paying attention to is if you're selling them.
It's a very good point, and something that we probably need to mull over a little bit longer prior to starting your podcast, as you've already pointed out. And then as you continue to grow and to develop your podcast content, making sure that you're staying true to whatever those metrics are that you have decided, and not get frustrated with your process because you keep, looking at the Joneses across the road and what they're doing.
Yeah, but we're allowed to evolve. So you can start a hobbyist thing and say, oh, I've turned this into a business and turn your podcast into a business. But you should change the way you're doing it and your metrics of success.
Rutendo, with the podcast sessions and obviously that going out as frequently and the quality being as high as it is, are you seeing more and more South Africans take up podcasting, or maybe across the continent, gravitating towards the content that you're creating, making that sort of opening the door just a little bit wider for them to step through and to follow in your footsteps and create your podcast for the very first time and get used to the tech and the terminologies and the jargon and the growing of the audiences? How has the podcast sessions grown?
So the podcast sessions as a podcast in itself, we've had to pull back, obviously because of the magazine and the online platform. And so, sometimes, especially in the journey, you've also got to pick what is your area of focus, right? So what we've found, as a whole in general, I can talk across the podcasts that I've produced, that I've, consulted on, et cetera, and, what we're generally seeing. But specifically to start off with the podcast sessions, if we're looking at the magazine and we're looking at our website, naturally and organically, very interesting, our audience that we've never marketed to has been an international audience. So the US, some UK, based, countries, people will come on and will consume the magazine and will, click on the links on our website and read our stories. With the podcast itself, when it was, running at full force, we definitely saw quite a lot of Pan-African listeners. So the podcast was Pan-African, South African, magazine, a lot of people overseas, and then looking at the continent, we obviously, in line with what podcasting is looking like, we saw South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, which of course are the top or among the top podcast producing countries and listeners. So that's pretty much what we've seen from a scope perspective. From our interaction and engagement perspective, so I was born in Zim and raised in South Africa, so naturally, I've always been very interested in Pan-African. So everything we do at the podcast sessions, even with Teensway Media, has a Pan-African aspect to it. And so, even when you're looking at how podcasting is growing in South Africa, and you compare that to what's happening in Nigeria and happening in Kenya, they're all bubbling at different beats. The kinds of content you're seeing is also very different. and one's approach to podcasting is different. And then again, your audience is different. You look at Nigeria, Nigeria numbers are massive. I mean, even if we're just looking at YouTube podcasts, it's almost like every Nigerian podcast has a video element to it. And
Okay.
their numbers are in the millions, super easy. Kenyan is almost like a middle ground, a couple of hundreds of thousands. And then with South Africa, it's almost like your very well-known podcasts. You'll see really, really big numbers. Your niche podcasts, consistent, really, really amazing. But they have that, what Gavin spoke about, you finding your niche audience, or, who are you basically podcasting for, and what is the purpose of your podcast? So for me, that's also very interesting to see. I think if we also just look, we take a step back and we don't just look at listeners, and we don't look at the production element of things, but we actually look at what is being created from even organizational perspective. That is also telling to say who is interested in this industry. So, I mean, recently, recently, literally in the last couple of years, we've obviously had, podcast festivals that have launched, and they've drawn a lot of international and Pan-African crowds. We've seen awards with, the APVA awards. We've seen research coming out, and whether that is your Africa Podfest research or your Edison research, there is interest. And they could only be interested if people are moving towards that. What's happening in Africa? What's happening in South Africa? What's happening in these spaces? And so, and then obviously we're seeing a number of partnerships pop up here and there. So I think that in itself, and then obviously like Spotify, I think it was last year, gave so much money to podcasters and their production. So if that is not telling enough to say, what is happening? And it's exciting to know that we have that Pan-African support of people who are saying, let's start awards, let's start a magazine, let's do this. When we're challenging in terms of, we look at AfriPods as well, in terms of libraries of, trying to create the biggest library of African podcasts. And then we're looking at internationally. There's no doubt that everyone is starting to look at the continent. I know there was mention earlier about like, we're in the starting grounds, but every year it gets bigger and bigger. How big can it get? How strong will it grow? Will it be as ambitious, and are we going to be seeing numbers that we're seeing in the US? Definitely. Will we see those collaborations and the money coming in, the studios coming in? I mean, I've recorded a number of things at Solid Gold. I absolutely love the setup, the studio. And it's all telling to say where I think we're going and what that looks like.
Yeah, I'm fascinated to hear numbers, like you say, the Nigerian podcasts and Kenyan podcasts, and it baffles my mind as to why South Africans haven't cottoned on to the content that's being created by their own, if that makes sense. Just yesterday, somebody said to me, do you think it's because data costs so much? And I said, well, yes, but we watch TikTok and we watch YouTube and we watch video, which consumes more data. Is that really a barrier to entry still? And if so, to what extent?
Yeah, just to add on quickly, just in terms of our South African podcasters, it's almost like there's a balance of podcasting specifically in South Africa. I think there are celebrities who've tried to launch podcasts thinking, we're celebrities, we will immediately get the numbers. That didn't happen. Then you find a number of people who are just your everyday person. They've launched podcasters and now have become celebrity podcasts. But no denying that we've seen some incredible numbers. I mean, Hustler's Corner, DJ Spoo, After School, Wisdom and Wellness, True Crime South Africa.
Phenomenal.
And then obviously one of the really big stories that came out in August was Podcast and Chill with Mac G, where they filled up the entire stadium. They're at 1 million subscribers on YouTube. So there's no denying the power and the numbers. Or like in comparison to Nigeria, my only comparison is we do have the numbers in South Africa. It's just in terms of the amount of podcasters who have those numbers in Nigeria are a lot bigger than what South Africa is. Yes.
Okay. No, fair enough. And you're quite right. There are guys that are pulling large numbers of listens monthly. Excuse me. I guess I get the impression and that not enough South Africans are aware of those instances. And when I mention the likes of True Crime South Africa, people will still say to me, there's a podcast called True Crime South Africa. I didn't know about it. How do we get more people to know about it? And I suppose that's back to that conversation about, well, until you find the podcast that resonates with you and that sort of opens the door, and then you start finding this entire world. We just have to make that connection with the right podcast for the right person at the right time for them to find all of these other opportunities. Um, Gavin, having produced as many podcasts as you have over the years, and clearly there's more and more interest year on year, the technology, how important is the technology still to this day to creating a good podcast?
There's no excuse for making a low quality planned podcast. Mm-hmm. You can't say, hey, Rutendo, Gavin, can join me on a podcast, and then it sounds like you recorded on a cell phone in an airport. Mm-hmm. The quality is a given if you're producing content that you want to be part of people's life. They must listen to it and not be aware of the quality. They shouldn't even think about quality. It should be. That said, if you're at the airport and you bump into Elon Musk and he says, yeah, sure, ask me some questions, and the only recording you've got is a crappy one on your phone, then the content trumps the quality.
Yeah.
Again, it really comes down to what podcast we're making. So let's just, let me ask you a fun question. It's always risky.
Okay.
Name me somebody who became famous from podcasting.
Somebody that became famous from podcasting, so didn't have a name or any claim to fame prior to.
Yeah.
I'm thinking.
And if you do find somebody, it'll probably be in a small space or in a very niche. There is no top 10 podcaster in the world who became famous from their podcast. Mm. The podcasting is the extension of the brand and their story and who they are. It's another channel. It's another outlet for them. So assuming, let's just play a numbers game here. There's 4 million ballpark podcasts in the world.
Okay.
I'd be surprised if 1,000 of them are making meaningful money, which is, I don't know, 1/10,000th of a percent. Mm-hmm. And those 1,000, that 1/10,000th% of all the podcasts are making 99.5% of all the money in the podcasting space. Mm. So thinking that you're going to start a podcast in your garage and capture those conversations on a Friday night that you think are awesome and turning as a podcast, great hobby. But if you think you're going to be knocking Joe Rogan off the top 10, I'm not saying it can't happen, but the odds don't favor it.
Yes.
So where does quality fit into that? As your audience grows, you're going to get better at it. You're going to become slicker. Your questions will be tighter. Your editing will be. It'll all get better, including your equipment. Initially, see if this is even something you want to be doing. A lot of people come to us. I mean, every day we get somebody coming. I want to start a podcast, and many of them do, and many of them make 3 or 4, and the itch is out of their system. They didn't really want to make a series. They just wanted this to scratch that itch. So scratch the itch. Pull out Spotify, Anchor got absorbed into Spotify. You pull out your phone, record, edit, publish, everything in one go, share it with your family and friends, do 5 episodes, and then see if you're addicted to this or if you're over it. And that was a fun exercise, like taking up jogging or cycling. It's something that you did for a little while. Tech is not, you don't get into a podcast by buying the tech first. It's the least of your problems, because you go, I've bought all this equipment, but I've decided I want to go out and interview people in the street, but I bought studio equipment. Oops.
Yes.
No. Take your phone, plug a microphone in, go and make some content and let it evolve. If you're proud of your first podcast, you took too long to make it.
Oh, I was proud of my third podcast, and you're so right. You're so right. Analysis paralysis prevented me from doing it for such a long time. I think the advice you're giving there is really, really great. And it's very true. We all are, and I guess this still stems back from the industry being 20 odd years old. It's still young enough for us all to learn and create better with each iteration. There isn't arriving at perfection by the time you put that first episode out. And still to this day, every episode I change something, I'll do something different I haven't tried before. I'm still experimenting, maybe why I love the medium as much as I do. And again, both of you have spoken very openly and clearly about the potential for growth um, there isn't enough yet. We haven't stopped writing books, haven't stopped making movies, we haven't stopped creating new YouTube channels. Why would we get to the point where there are too many podcasters or too many podcasts? At the moment, though, out of interest sake, where do you think the most potential is if someone is considering their podcast? And I think a lot of people are starting to go, how can I monetize my podcast? What do I need to do to get the money in? Because that'll make it, that much more fun to put together. Maybe the potential for growth isn't necessarily there, but it is in streamlining processes. How many South African digital platforms do we have that capture or that streamline workflows or that enable podcasters to create this content easily? There are so many that are coming from international platforms, and they're great, and I love using them. But maybe there's potential there for South Africans to tap into that side of the podcasting market. Do you have any opinions there?
Uh, yeah, I can. I'll
Rutendo,
start.
go for it.
So I think one of the things, and Gavin also touched on it, is just in terms of the tech behind it. I think one thing anyone coming in must realize that it's not difficult. You've almost just got to be able to surrender to the process. And you've almost got to think of it like you're riding a bike for the first time. You are learning to swim for the first time. As adults, I think we find it a little bit more challenging to start things for the first time because we're like, oh my word, I'm so bad at this. I'm never going to do it again. So we've almost got to approach it as an addition to our lives, whether it's personal for a career, to say, I'm a beginner. Think of it as the 10,000 hours, as Malcolm Gladwell said. If you haven't reached 10,000 hours, keep moving. And then just in terms of processes, so yes, recording quality, getting the right mic, et cetera, but also understanding that companies have now made it so much easier to join the podcasting bandwagon. Yes, there was a time where you needed a studio, or people thought you needed a studio and mic and an editor, and then I need a social media manager, and then I need this, and you're thinking, this is the job for a very big team, but you'd be surprised to know that behind some of these really big podcasts, especially on the African continent, is just the team of one. It's one person who's creating a number of these things. You can go to Solid Gold Studios, for example, record your podcast, get the audio, and then you can edit it yourself, or you can have them edit it, or you can, there's so many mechanisms. But again, just coming to technology, we're recording this remotely online. Riverside, even if you don't have a microphone and you have an internet connection, it actually has, the audio is pretty decent. It's really clean. So we're thinking about remote recording. We're thinking about editing software tools, especially now with AI technology. You can, if you wanted to, use AI to create an end-to-end podcast and just come in and be like, hey, hi, welcome. These are my questions that I got from AI. If you want to go that route. So what I'm saying is the time and effort behind these things, one, and I know I need to as well, because I'm editing, I need to research. Why is it taking me three hours to edit a podcast episode? Now it takes me a lot less, but I had to start there. And then just in terms of growth, utilize social media. Podcasting is growing. It's booming on TikTok. It's actually ridiculous. I found so many amazing podcasts on TikTok because I saw a few clips and I'm like, oh my goodness, no. Then I'll go and listen to the entire podcast because I was just like, how did this happen? So you'll find a lot of podcasters are now putting clips on TikTok. TikTok is also making it easier for people to include podcasts. You've got YouTube that has included, their podcast strip. You've got now, Spotify, create your end-to-end podcast on Spotify. So brands, production, they're making it so easy. You just need to figure it out and figure out how best to work it for yourself. But also don't think about it as in like eating the entire elephant. Find one or two mechanisms, one or two platforms, and make it easier on yourself. Just say, okay, cool. For recording, I'm going to use this. For editing, I'm going to use this. For design, I'm going to use Canva. I'm going to start simple and get into the flow of things. But everything that one needs, I think, is already there. It just takes not trying to, and this is the other thing, don't try and aim to get every single listener. Oh, I need I need 1,000 listens on every single podcast episode. That's not how we're starting. You increase, give yourself KPIs for your podcast as well, if you must. But just using the tools that are already there, I think, is key.
Yeah, and to the point about 1,000 listens on each episode, one of the other things I really enjoy about podcasting, if the content is created in such a way that it's evergreen, those listens are going to find you eventually. If your content is good and it's discoverable and it's there, people will find it. So you might not have 100 listens the first day you release your episode, but you go back in a couple of months' time and it's accrued that listenership, it's developed, it's growing, and that in itself is inspiring. I'm very inspired listening to both of you talk about your journeys thus far and your wealth of knowledge as far as the continent's podcasting capabilities is concerned. Uh, in closing, you're obviously very excited about the future of podcasting locally, across the continent, and then internationally. What do you think is going to be the next thing that podcasters start to focus on? If we forget about the monetization stuff for a moment and we look into 2024, 2025, what are we going to be making sure that we put into our audio stories to capture audience's attention, Gavin? Where's your focus at this point in time for your clients?
Our clients are corporate and large international companies, NGOs. We make a lot of podcast series to help them communicate with their stakeholders and people involved in their organizations. Going to podcasting to make money is possibly one of the hardest things you can decide to do. And it's not going to get easy for a while. And there's two big reasons it's not going to get easy. And one is there is no programmatic buying of advertising around podcasts that's effective yet. A lot of people are working on it, and there's some smart people, and there's some hosting platforms, and it's going to come. But even if there's somebody out there selling adverts around podcasts, you still have to make a podcast that generates more than 1,000 listens, because at 1,000 listens, it's more work for an ad agency to book one CPM and send you 400. It's got to be meaningful. If you're going into that space, you either have to be broad or hyper niched. You either have to be competing against SABC Radio 2,000, 750,000 audience. Either you have to deliver and advertise to 750,000 people, or you have to say there are 500 people in this country who are left-handed fly fishermen and they all listen to my podcast. I own that zone. Give me money.
Yes.
Those two things. The bigger challenge is when you're dealing with commercial podcast is brand risk. The bigger the audience, the bigger the risk. So I build a podcast, I've got 1 million followers, and I would go to an advertiser and say, give me money. And they go, what happens if you badmouth our brand and there's some damage to it? What do we do? Well, just trust me, I won't do that. Now, if you do that with Prime Media, if you do that with SABC, somebody screws up an advert or a brand, hit the pavement, ass on the pavement, you're fired.
There's recourse. Yeah.
But when you're dealing with a podcaster who's a one-person show, an audience of 1 million people, it's too much risk. It's too much risk to go to a blue chip advertiser. You can't go to a washing powder and say, here, take a chance on this, unless you've an audience of 10 million or 50 million and they're trustworthy. But again, that's the outlier of the outlier. So the monetization thing is a long way to go before you can go, oh, well, this is my business. I'm getting up, I'm leaving school, I'm going to start a podcast as a business. You can start a YouTube channel. You can start an unwrapping channel. You can start there's paths to success in that space already, but that's a much more mature market. So that's not there yet. What we're going to see more of, companies and organizations using podcasting as a way of communicating. The stuff that you phone a help desk for or go online for, you don't have to read it. You can search and listen to the answer to that question. There's going to be more communication with very, very targeted audiences. Welcome to the new company. It's your first week. Here's a podcast series to listen to. There's a message from the team. That kind of stuff's going to grow. We're going to see companion podcasts are going to be huge. And I think we're going to see something called a hybrid series where you're going to alternate watching and listening. So, watch 2 episodes on YouTube and then 3 podcasts come out, or watch it on TV and then 6 podcasts. So you're kind of watching some to establish the scenery and the people, and then you listen to a whole number of episodes. Not a companion, but an extension. And I think after listening to that for 6 months, if you and I had a chat about that series, you'd be hard-pressed to remember which ones you watched and which ones you listened to, because they would all get conflated into your memory of which was which. Picture making Star Wars. Our budget's limited. Okay, we'll blow the Death Star up during the podcast. where we just need some sound effects. We don't need graphics. So you
Yes.
can get more bang for your buck if you're doing some video, some audio. So I think we're going to see that. And then I think podcasting is going to be the gateway to community radio. I think community radio
Yeah.
stations are going to buy 5 P4s and microphones. You want to be a DJ? Go out, record interviews, learn how to edit, make some content. We put it on our podcast channel. We measure which podcasts the community is engaging with. And at the end of a quarter, the podcast with the highest engagement, you get a show on the community radio station next, and use it as a way of
Amazing,
training,
yeah.
upskilling. I think that's what we're going to see. If we zoom out
Yeah.
over the next few years.
Yeah. And even that, when you talk about community radio stations, potentially university radio stations as well, especially the smaller radio stations, or maybe the universities that don't have well-established radio stations, can do a very similar thing in developing whatever that community is. I mean, they've got a captive audience right there, and capturing those conversations, those sentiments from year in and year out. Very, very true. Very interesting.
As opposed to being, ephemeral, gone. But when it's done that way, and I don't think we're very far away from credible educational institutions accepting your final work as a podcast. Why does it have to be a thesis? Why can't it be a podcast series? Cool, you've got your citations and there's still some paperwork attached, but why can't you submit it as a series of interviews and conclusion? Why not? Why wouldn't you listen to a thesis?
Fascinating. Oh, it makes me even more excited. Rutendo, I don't know, is there something that you can think of that Gavin hasn't mentioned yet for the future of podcasting?
I was gonna say everything Gavin said, just re-record in my voice, use AI.
Goodness.
What I will add is maybe just one from a content perspective and then from a business perspective. So from a content perspective, I think the one thing that we saw a lot when podcasts came out, and even to a certain extent now, is the typical interview style podcast. So just you and I, hey, how are you? I'm having this conversation. And I think in the beginning, there wasn't too much formatting around it. It was kind of like, let's just hit record and let's go. Right now, there is more of a curation. We're having this interview because there's a specific reason. We could talk for hours, but there is a specific reason we're having this conversation. And then adding to that is these narrative-driven podcasts, I think, are going to become more and more popular. So your True Crime South Africa, we're telling you the story of something that has happened. Those kinds of things we're seeing more and more as time goes by. True crime in itself is one niche that is boomed, but I think that narrative style is becoming more popular internationally. Obviously, there's a lot of amazing documentary style podcasts. There are a handful across the African continent that have done so well, and I think with the time, effort, and energy, and sometimes it's the monetary backing behind it, we have a lot more of those stories to tell. And then from a business perspective, I will definitely say, the one thing that excites me about looking at the US market is being able to see, oh, there's an podcast editing job that's popped up. Oh, so-and-so production job that's popped up. And I think in time, we will see more and more of those coming into play. Right now, it's individualistic. It's, oh, I've hired so-and-so to edit. I'm going to this place to record. So-and-so is doing my social media. But we're going to see, as these industries start to grow, those jobs becoming skills that people need to nurture and adopt and have. And then you can sell that. And actually, imagine being a full-time, there are some South African companies and international companies that are doing this, or Pan-African companies that are doing this, but on mass scale. And then the last thing that I will touch on is, again, sorry, all my references have to be US-based because there's just so much that's happening there.
Just research,
It's research. So there is, a lot of research, and I think we're going to get more research. I mean, some of the research that's coming out of the US will tell you the kind of car that a certain podcaster of a certain demographic will be listening to your podcast at. And that for me is just, it's fascinating, right? So I think we're going to be pulling on a lot more research, and that obviously will and in larger numbers. We are doing research at the moment, but we're talking about smaller numbers, which is case in point. I see that increasing. I definitely think there are going to be a lot more awards that'll pop up. Right now, we have, again, handful of awards that are happening. Yes, we've got in South Africa, DSTV Content Creator Awards. The Spotify category is the podcast category is being funded, or it's brought to you by Spotify. So we are going to see a lot more of these collaborations, a lot more awards, your APVA awards. I mean, I do foresee niche-based or more specific awards popping up. And then again, on the content side of things, yes, there are people, yes, I'll just speak to the podcast sessions. Yes, we're doing news at the moment, and there are some people who are doing news popping up here and there. I do see a lot more news coming to the forefront. I do see a lot more people speaking about the industry. You'll see, even it's so fascinating, across various news industry platforms, they're talking about the news of podcasting. A few months ago, there was, the top 5 most stylish Nigerian podcasters.
Right.
Yes. So it's this kind of content where it's not just like, oh, listen to this podcast. It's like, oh, this podcaster is presenting here. They're speaking at this event. We're going to see a lot more of that. So showcasing, it's the branding, it's the industry insights side of podcasting that I think will definitely grow.
Yeah, that's I mean, we talk about from time to time, parents saying to their children, what are you going to do when you grow up? And listening to the both of you, we're realizing that there are jobs that don't exist yet, that in a couple of months, years from now, it'll be far more acceptable to say, I'm going to be a podcast editor, or I'm going to be a podcast producer, or I manage a slate of podcasts. It'll be something far more within our vocabulary, within our colloquial way of speaking about jobs. Hopefully that will be one. And on the content creation side, I'd like to personally see more children's content being created. As we see this wave of parents trying to get their kids off screens and consuming content that is stimulating for their brain, I'm hoping that being a continent of storytellers will gravitate towards those really good stories to tell children, and maybe companion as well. Maybe not the visuals in terms of video, but maybe visuals in terms of books or something along those lines that has a very strong educational aspect. So I'd like to see stuff like that. Guys, this has been awesome. Thank you so very much for your insights, for your time, for the wealth that you continue to pour into all of your clients and anybody that asks you about podcasting. I think we're in very good hands if we refer to you again as podcasting powerhouses of the continent, or at least of the country. Continent is large. So again, Rutendo, thank you very much for your time. And Gavin, thank you so much for your time. We'll make sure that people understand where they can find you on the socials and online as well, to keep growing the podcasting industry in South Africa. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sean, and keep on podcasting. And nice to see you again, Rutendo.
Good to see you too, Gavin. Thank you, Sean.